In this video, I'm going to share how to place the front brakes on this Dodge Durango. Pads and rotors located right behind your front wheel, so let's get started. Using a 22mm socket, take off all 5 lug nuts and remove the wheel. Let's remove this clip, this spring retainer, I'll call it, and it hooks onto the caliper ears here, and then has these tabs that are spring-loaded going around the bracket. Now it's secured only in here, so take a pry bar and try to pry it out. It might also help to have something like a flathead screwdriver that you can push in on to unhook it while you pry out. Just like that. Carefully remove it. Now I'm turning this all the way. I like to do this so I can have better access to the back side of the caliper. Next, I'd like to compress the piston, and to do that, you're gonna have to open up the bleeder screw, pop the cap off of it, and I'm gonna use a pry bar right in here to pry on the pistons of the caliper through the rotor. It's a lot easier this way. I have a collection bucket with a hose attached to it. I'm gonna put that right on the bleeder screw, and with an 11mm wrench, I'm gonna break this free. If you don't have a hose to put on here, make sure you have something to catch the fluid. It'll actually start shooting straight up as soon as you compress these pistons, or you could do this after you remove the caliper, but I find it easier to do it now. Stick the pry bar in here and pry the pistons in. The caliper should move very smoothly. If it doesn't, that means there's an issue. Something's binding up, whether it's the pistons or the slider pins. Now I'm going to wait about 30 seconds. Because I have a hose right here, I'm going to leave this up like that. That way any air bubbles can make their way up and the caliper can bleed out of any air that may have potentially gotten in here. This is looking pretty good, so I'm ready to close this off. Take that 11mm wrench, snug the bleeder screw. There we go. About 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out is plenty. Remove my hose. Use brake parts cleaner to clean up any mess that you made. And once that's cleaned up, cap it back off. From the back side, you'll have 2 plastic caps covering up the slide pin holes. And in here, each slide pin will take an H11 or a hex 11 socket. I actually don't have a hex 11, I have a 10 and a 12, so I'm gonna go for the 10. And although it does work, you have to be very careful not to strip it out. Preferably use an 11mm. Unthread both of them, and keep in mind that as you unthread these, when they're done unthreading, they won't just come out. They actually slide through the caliper in a rubber sleeve, so they'll kind of just keep spinning over and over until you push them out or pull them out. Oh, there we go. Caliper's moving. That means they're completely unthreaded. Push them out from the back side a little bit. This will allow you to clear the bracket and remove the caliper. Careful, this inner pad's going to want to fall out, so remove it. And at this point I'm going to push the slide pins out so we can clean them and re-lubricate them. Take the other one out as well. Set the caliper aside. I'm going to tuck it in the control arm up there. You don't want to pull on this brake hose. Remove the outer pad as well. Now these 2 are inverted Torx bolts. They're E20, so you're going to have a socket that can pull these off. They are pretty tight. So get a breaker bar or an impact and remove both of these bolts that hold the caliper onto the knuckle. There's one, and the other one. Remove them both and pull the bracket off. In order to remove the rotor, there's actually a little O-ring here that we have to take off with a pick. It's going to be the easiest way to do it. Just pull it off, and if it's in very poor condition, you're going to have to discard it and maybe get a new one, but mine's good, so I'm going to clean it up and reuse it. Now remove your rotor. If it's stuck, hammer between the lug studs to break it free off the hub and remove it. The hub surface needs to be clean in order to properly mount the rotor nice and flat, nice and flush, so you don't have any braking issues. Hopefully yours isn't too rusted, because if it is, you're gonna have to sand it down nice and flat so the rotor can mount flush. I don't want to unnecessarily remove material, so I'm just gonna use a wire brush and clean off the surface rust that's here. Once you've cleaned it off, rinse it with brake parts cleaner. I'm going to put a thin layer of anti-seize on the surface of the hub, especially on this outer ridge and the inner ridge where the rotor sits. This is where it's going to seize if it does. And I also don't want it to build up rust, because rust will swell up and push the rotor off the hub, therefore causing braking issues. So I'm going to coat this in a thin layer. You don't want a lot, because if you put too much, it's actually going to fling out as you drive, and that's obviously not a good thing. In the center here where it's recessed, I'm going to coat it just a very thin layer so it doesn't rust in the future, but that area isn't as important because the rotor doesn't actually touch that. Take the rotor and put it on backwards just temporarily so we can clean the surface of the rotor. Use a little bit of brake parts cleaner and a clean paper towel or a rag to degrease the surface if it does have any grease. Now we're using these rotors that have a special coating on them that does not have grease, but I do like to wipe them off anyway, just in case I have any fingerprints on them. Now that this side is clean, flip it over, install it the right way, and we'll clean this side off as well. Let's get that O-ring seated back on the surface of the hub, and the way to do it is to just kind of walk it around like that. This is also going to hold the rotor on, so that's great. Here's the caliper bracket that we have to clean up. There really isn't a whole lot to clean on this except for the areas where the pads sit, and this isn't very rusted. It's actually just a lot of brake dust. So what I'm going to do is take a wire brush, brush this off, and that should be plenty. This being aluminum, you don't want to remove material by sanding it down and accidentally making this area too large and pads wobble around. Then you need a caliper bracket. Typically, I wouldn't be lubricating the area where the pads directly touch. However, this is not a typical caliper, so I will put a tiny amount of grease on here. This is brake-rated silicone paste, so it can withstand higher temperatures. It won't melt off. And this will allow the pad to slide quietly and smoothly because there's no anti-rattle clip. There's really nothing other than the pad directly touching on this metal. This should also prevent some corrosion from building up, which if it does build up, it'll seize the pad in place and then you'll have other braking issues happening. Very, very thin layer if you're going to do this. If you don't want to, you don't have to. It's just what I prefer, especially in this climate that the vehicle lives in. It is prone to rust, so I want to cover this. While I'm here, I'm also going to inspect my slide pins. They are a little bit dirty. There's a little bit of rust here, but it's really just debris and grease buildup that has stuck to these. So I'm going to take these over to the wire wheel and clean these off. Brake parts cleaner might also clean the majority of this, but I want a nice fresh coating on these, and then of course we'll lubricate the inside of the caliper where these slide. If you put grease on this area, it's actually just going to wipe off as you slide it in. So I'm going to skip past that. I'm just going to clean them, and then we'll lubricate right before these go on. Now carefully install the caliper bracket. Let's snug this up, and the torque for these is 125 foot-pounds. On the pads, the inner pad is going to go on the caliper. The outer pad just goes right on the bracket. It just slides right on, just like that, and sits there. The easiest way that I found to get this pad seated in the pistons, other than of course pushing it with your hand, is going to be using a caliper depression tool. So what that does is once you get the pad seated in here, use the same tool that you would use to press your pistons back in and squish the pad into the pistons. Perfect. That's just seated. Doesn't take a whole lot of pressure with that, but it avoids you fighting it the whole time. And last thing before we get the caliper in, take some silicone paste or brake grease and put it inside the two holes of the slider pins. You don't need a lot. If you put too much, it'll actually come out the other side as you slide the pins in, so just keep that in mind. Now take the caliper, slide it over the pad and the rotor, right into position. Take your 2 slider pins and slide them through. Start them into the bracket, and once both are started, let's bottom them out. The torque on both of these slider pins is 41 foot-pounds. Don't forget to put the 2 little caps over. This is what's going to prevent the grease from leaking out and the debris from getting in there, drying out the slide pins. Make sure everything works smoothly. Now let's reinstall this spring. I'm going to hook it on the top first. Oops. Hook it on the top and then push it onto the bottom. This can be a little bit tricky. You have to hold it and pry it at the same time. Okay, that's partially locked in. Be careful. Push it in the rest of the way. And it's actually still not in all the way. You need to not be able to see the end of these hooks because they go into a little slot. So what I'm going to do is tap them in with a hammer. That's 1 and 2. There we go. I cannot see the ends of the hooks. This is properly secured here. Caliper is mounted and brake job is done. Let's get the wheel on. Get the wheel back on, start on all 5 lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern. Also in a cross pattern, torque them to 130 foot-pounds. Wheels back on, do the same on the other side, pump up the brake pedal, top off the master cylinder, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.